chance to welcome all of you alumni, future alumni, family, friends, to the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies annual reunion event. My name is Ilyana Kuzhemko. I'm the co-director of the Griswold Center. And for those of you who don't know about our center, we put on events such as these throughout the year. We have 2 major symposia every year. That's a 2-day deeper dive into a particular issue. The next one in the fall is going to be what to do about places that have been left behind in a more globalized economy. And the ultimate goal of the center is to foster communication between academics, policymakers, and members of the business community. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can find me or our executive director, Dana Molina, and find out more about membership. We wanted to take a moment to thank the generosity of our members, and in particular, the generosity of Ben Griswold and his wife, Wendy, without whom we could not be putting on these events. Like I said, we put on a number of things every year, but the reunions event is always one of our favorites, and it's a real honor to welcome back Greg Mankiw back to campus, where he was a Princeton undergrad, for a discussion on the fiscal outlook. That should be, I think, very simple and straightforward. We'll finish up very quickly, moderated by our own Alan Blinder. Alan will introduce Greg, so let me just take a moment to introduce my colleague, Alan. Alan Blinder is the Gordon S. Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs and the founder of the Griswold Center. Alan served as vice chair of the Board of Governors in the Federal Reserve System and a member of the CEA under President Bill Clinton. He's written scores of scholarly articles and was one of our profession's best communicators. He holds an MSc from the London School of Economics and a PhD from MIT, but of course, his most important accomplishment was being Princeton's class of '67. On a personal note, I just want to say that in these incredibly turbulent times, I feel so lucky to have, as a colleague, someone like Alan who brings such wisdom, experience, and level-headedness to these confusing times. So, Alan, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce Greg.
Is there another mic? I'll use this.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Ilyana. It is really a great pleasure for me to introduce Greg Mankiw. Princeton class of 1980, I might start. We won't leave that to the end. That's right up front. A summa cum laude in economics. And I might add, maybe the best student I ever had. I've had a few really fabulous students over the years. It's very hard to say who's number 1, who's number 2, who's number 3. Greg is a strong candidate for number 1. Very, very fabulous student. I was his thesis advisor, and I had the silly idea that I might help a young scholar out by helping him publish a piece of his senior thesis in a scholarly journal. Little did I know, a torrent of such papers was about to come from the pen of Greg Mankiw as a MIT graduate student and as a young professor. He left here with an intent, I'm not sure how serious the intent was, of studying both law and economics. So law at the Harvard Law School and economics at MIT. Luckily for the profession, he was disabused of the idea of becoming a lawyer relatively quickly, and we kept him as an economist. He got his PhD from MIT in 1984, and note this, he became a full professor at Harvard in 1987. Do the math. From 2003 to 2005, under what I'm going to call a normal Republican administration, Greg was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, a job he did superbly, as he does everything superbly, and including being one of the best-selling textbook writers ever. His Principles of Economics textbook is now in its 10th edition, is that right? Mine's in the 14th, but the 14th is the last. And by the way, he surpassed what I was selling a long time ago. A long time ago. The last thing I want to say before turning the microphone over is that what has distinguished Greg, in addition to his productivity, is the knack he has for developing simple models that make a point that lead you to think, why didn't I think of that? You didn't need 127 equations to make that point, and a Mankiw paper is not like that. It makes a point, you nod your head, and you say, yeah, that's right. And I wish I had thought of that first, but I didn't. Greg thought of it first. So I give you Greg Mankiw.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a delight to be here in my 45th reunion. It's particularly an honor to be introduced by Alan Blinder, who has been a role model for me throughout my career. He was a fantastic lecturer. I had his course as an undergraduate. He was a fantastic senior thesis advisor, and he really has been a role model throughout my career, whether I've thought about becoming a macroeconomic teacher or researcher or columnist or a policymaker in Washington. I felt I was always following in Alan's footsteps. I think the only way I deviated from Alan's footsteps was when I went to work what Alan thought was the wrong party. But other than that, I think we are really very much on the same page in terms of what economists should do and what role they should play in the world. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Alan. We agreed on this topic about 6 months ago about the features of government debt, deficits, fiscal policy, and so on. And I was worried at the time that maybe all those issues would be resolved by now. But that turned out not to be the case. In fact, it turns out to be particularly timely because this big, beautiful bill is going through Congress, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's not my main focus today, although that's a piece of the broader picture. And so what I want to do is talk about fiscal policy and government debt and how we should think about that. Now, this is a cartoon. The little boy's coming home, and he's from school, and he says, what's this I hear about you adults mortgaging my future? And this is actually originally from the Wall Street Journal, but I actually reprinted in one of my textbooks on the chapter on government debt. And I don't think this is actually a very funny cartoon, particularly. So that's not why I reprinted or why I'm showing it to you, but I actually think it summarizes very succinctly what we need to know about government debt. Right? If you want to leave the high life, rack up credit card bills, and then leave the bills to your children to pay off, you can't do that. You can't leave a negative bequest. You can leave a positive bequest, you can leave a zero bequest, but you can't leave a negative bequest to your children. With one exception, if you do it through the government, you can. And that is basically what government debt represents. It represents a negative bequest that one generation is leaving to the future. Now, we in macroeconomic courses then talk about the implications of that. What does it mean for capital accumulation, interest rates, the trade deficit? We can there's of course implications of this, but the starting point of all this is that it's a transfer of resources from future generations to the current generation. It's a negative bequest that you can only do through the government. So that's the first thought I want to leave you with. Now, to get a little more nerdy here, here's actually a graph. You see lots of places. I picked this from one of my textbooks, but you can see this lots of places. This is the ratio of the US government debt to GDP. GDP being, of course, the total income of the economy and a measure of our ability to service the debt. So it's a measure of the tax base, basically. And you see that the amount of government debt has fluctuated a lot over time. It's gone basically from zero, where it was in the mid-19th century, to about 100%, where we're at the end of World War II, which is its peak. And it tends to go up in two circumstances. It tends to go up in wars, because wars are expensive, especially major wars. And you see that this thing spikes up in all the major wars. And it also spikes up in times of crisis. So if you're thinking about the Great Depression, the Great Recession of 2008 after the financial crisis, the COVID-19 recession, and the shutdown of lots of the economy, government debt sort of shoots up. And then during peacetime, usually, not always, but usually in peacetime, it tends to decline, partly because we pay it off, partly because we have economic growth, and as a result, the denominator is growing faster than the numerator in this ratio, and therefore government debt is sort of declining as a share of the economy. Now, I should note here, by the way, that 100% is not a special number. The UK has at times gone well above 100% in the 19th century, so it's not like 100% is some magic threshold. But for us, it's been basically the maximum that the US has experienced in our time. Now, this is history. These are facts about the past. The question then becomes, what do we think about the future, and what does the future look like? And here's basically the same ratio as projected forward by the Congressional Budget Office, which is the sort of best nonpartisan arbiter of what policy is doing. And what you see is not only are we, again, close to the all-time peak reached at the end of World War II, but unlike the end of World War II, the current rise in government debt is not about to reverse itself. So, after World War II, we saw this thing decline quite rapidly for the next 30 years or so, but going forward, this ratio is going to continue increasing because we have pretty large budget deficits on the books, and you just sort of add those budget deficits up, you get this projected increase in government debt. Now, I should note, by the way, that the CBO does not assume any major crisis. They do not assume a major war. They do not assume a major financial crisis or a COVID kind of event. They're assuming kind of normal peace and prosperity, but nonetheless, we're going to see growth going up. This debt going up as a share of GDP. This also assumes normal growth, 3% growth. So it's not as if it's assuming a static economy, but it's assuming kind of the growth that a reasonable person would project given historic events. This also, by the way, does not include the big, beautiful bill. This is under current law. So this is what's going to happen under current law. Now, the White House press secretary has said that the big, beautiful bill is going to reduce the budget deficit. No independent analyst believes that's true. Everyone thinks that's going to increase the budget deficit, and therefore this thing will be rising more rapidly than under current projections. So this is sort of the baseline that we're starting with. And what I want to talk about is how we're going to end this. The economist Herb Stein famously said, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. And if you look at that debt to GDP ratio going up, under current law, it's going to go up forever. But that can't happen. It can't go on forever. Debt really can't go up to infinity as time goes on. So it's going to stop. I have no doubt that Herb Stein was right, that this rising debt to GDP ratio will stop. Now, simply saying that is not very reassuring, because the question is, how is it going to stop? How painful is the stop going to be? What else is going to go on in the economy? And so what I've tried to do here in this slide is show you the only 5 ways that I know of that this could stop. And I want to talk through each of these. And as you're thinking about these, I want you to think, okay, what's the probability of each of these things happening? Now, if you think this thing has to stop, those probabilities have to sum to at least 100%. And the reason I say at least is more than one of these things could happen. We could do a couple of these things, but at least one of these things has to happen. So the probabilities have to sum to at least 100%. The problem is when you think about each of these possible events, each of them seems pretty unlikely. It's hard to actually get the number up to 100%, but you have to get it up to 100%. So you can think now about what you think the probabilities of the different events are. And at the end, you can also sort of revisit that. And I'll tell you what I think is likely to occur too. So what are the 5 ways out? One way is we could grow really fast. Kathy Wood, the head of ARC Innovation Fund, one of these tech funds, says that when we're about to hit the singularity, AI is going to create great growth. So going forward, rather than having 3% growth, we're going to have 6% growth. That would be wonderful. That would be great if we could have 6% growth. Now, of course, it costs a lot of disruption. Some jobs would be destroyed, others would be created. But that would be fantastic if we just grow ourselves out of this debt. Now, no matter how much debt you've racked up, if your income grows fast enough, that'll take care of it. And maybe that could happen. But I'm mentioning that only as a logical possibility. I think to me, who knows what the future holds? To me, the idea of 6% growth going forward seems very, very unlikely. It would be very, very imprudent to plan on that. It'd be like saying, don't worry about my credit card debt, I'm about to win the lottery. So maybe we will win the lottery. So I can't rule it out logically, but it seems like a very unlikely possibility. But I also want to mention it only from the standpoint of completeness, that I want to mention all the possible ways that this could end. Another thing we could do is default. We just say, there's all this debt we have, never mind. Never mind. Now, the idea of defaulting on the debt is not as crazy as it sounds. It's not a good idea, but it's not impossible. And if you look around the world, we've seen Russia default on the debt in the 90s. We saw Argentina default several times. We've seen Greece default not that long ago. So we've seen governments default on debt all the time. When this nation was founded, James Madison actually thought default might be a reasonable possibility. They had accumulated lots of debt during the Continental War, and Madison had noted that a lot of this debt had been sold to speculators who bought it for way below par. And he said, wouldn't it be terrible if all those speculators got this huge capital gain if we paid these debts off at par? He said, maybe we shouldn't do that. He ended up losing that battle to Alexander Hamilton, who said, that's not really a good idea to start a new nation defaulting on the debt. But it was talked about. In fact, we did default on the debt in the 1930s, and that's what this book is about that I have on the screen. It's a wonderful book by Sebastian Edwards, an economist, but the book is more history than economics. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt went off the gold standard, and that was just probably a good move. It helped. I think most economists think that going off the gold standard helped recover from the Great Depression. But he had this problem, which is that they had lots of government debt that had a gold clause in it that said you had to pay off the debt at a particular rate in gold, and that would make the debt really, if you devalue the dollar, go off the gold standard, then all of a sudden this debt would be very, very expensive to pay off. And he said, that gold clause, never mind. He basically wanted to cross out that clause. It's a form of default. You're not allowed to take your mortgage and say, I don't like this clause now. I'm going to cross that one out. Well, that's what he wanted to do. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was one of the reasons he wanted to pack the court, actually, to make sure he could win this. He didn't pack the court, but he did win the final decision on a 5-4 vote. So he came very close to not being able to do this, which would have made going off the gold standard much more expensive for the government, but he did. But it is a form of default. There's no question that it's a form of default, which is why this book is called American Default. And this book is really about the history of that episode, the history of the economic battles inside the Roosevelt administration and the legal battles inside the courts. So I strongly recommend that if you're interested in this topic. So default is one thing we could do. Now you might say, well, gee, we would never default. This is the United States of America. We don't do that. Well, here is what candidate Trump said about government debt. This is back from 1916. I just want to read. I can't do his voice, but I'd love to. But anyway, so here's what he says. I am the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt. And if things don't work out, I renegotiate the debt. I mean, that's a smart thing, not a stupid thing. You can see him saying that, right? Doesn't that sound like Trump? And the journalist says, how do you renegotiate the debt? And you say, you go back and say, hey, guess what? The economy crashed. I'm going to give you back half. That is default, right? He's very familiar with that. He has a lot of experience with that. So the fact that a candidate would say this, they might say, that's ridiculous. We would never do anything as crazy as default on the US debt. Well, is it any more crazy than saying no foreign students can come to Harvard University? I don't think so. I don't think so. So I wouldn't put it past our current president to, if a crisis hits, to him to view this as one of the options on the table. Now, the other solution, people often say, you don't ever need to default on your debt. If you print, as long as your debt's denominated in your own currency, you can just print it. Well, we have lots of history where people just print their own money. We know how that works. It happened, if you look at Germany in the 1920s, one of the most recent ones is Zimbabwe from 2006 to 2009, where they basically were running deficits and couldn't borrow, and so refinanced that just by printing Zimbabwe dollars. And this sort of shows you the evolution of what a typical unit of currency in Zimbabwe looks like. So 1 year you were carrying around 50 Zimbabwe dollars. 3 years later you were carrying around 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars. And if you think 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars is a lot of money, now you can buy one of those as a novelty for just a few bucks. on Amazon. So, and basically they eventually abandoned the Zimbabwe currency altogether, went to the US dollar for a little while, tried to introduce the Zimbabwe dollar again, had another high inflation. So we have lots of experience when you just try to print money. So when people say, oh, we never need to default because we can always print money, it's not clear to me that you'd rather print money. Right? If you have to choose between default and hyperinflation, you might say default's actually the least painful option. I don't know. But simply being able to print your own money is not nearly the panacea that some people suggest it is. And one of my favorite images from the Zimbabwe episode was this one. That was a picture was taken in a Zimbabwe restroom. Now, here's, I think, one of the fundamental facts about monetary economics. If you have to warn people not to flush their money down the toilet, the monetary system is not working well. Now, why do these hyperinflations occur? They tend to occur when the central bank, which is the ultimate creator of money, and the fiscal authority, the president and Congress, are too tightly aligned. And if you poll economists and ask them, what do you think about the presidents having more direct influence on monetary policy than we have now, almost every economist agrees that it would lead to worse outcomes if the president had more influence on monetary policy. An independent central bank is, I think, pretty much an unanimous view of almost all economists. I should know, by the way, the current president of the White House thinks he knows monetary policy better than Jerome Powell. He regularly insults Jerome Powell, says he would know better what to do if he were running the central bank. He's obviously not a believer in central bank independence, but the combination of his willingness to consider default on the debt and his running very big deficits makes you wonder if we really did have a less independent central bank, that high inflation could well be the outcome. I should note that the independence of the central bank is not something that is baked into the Constitution. The central bank was created by an act of Congress. How much independence it has can be changed by Congress very easily. So the saying, oh, we will never have a high inflation because we have a sensible, independent central bank, it is not a promise that the high inflation outcome could occur. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is reductions in government spending. President Trump came in and appointed Elon Musk to head the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. And one thing he started doing is firing lots of government employees, fairly willy-nilly. There was this sort of, I think, sense among some people that, oh, the government has gotten too big, too bloated, we have too many government employees. Well, this just shows you federal civilian employees as a percentage of all employees in the economy. And you see now the government is not particularly bloated. It's actually small by historical standards. It's not like there's lots of government bureaucrats who are sitting around doing nothing. So this idea that this is the first thing you're going to attack when you would think we need smaller government is just not right. It's true that government spending has been growing, but it's not been growing because we have all these federal employees doing nothing. It's basically been growing because we have lots of non-employee spending programs. Peter Fisher, who was a Treasury official in the first Bush administration, I worked with him a little bit when I was there, he once referred to the federal government as an insurance company with an army. And that's become a sort of very famous expression now, and it's exactly right because it does describe what the federal government does. A large fraction of what the federal government does is insurance things like Social Security, things like healthcare programs. And the share of government spending that are in those programs is growing over time, in part because healthcare spending tends to grow over time, but mainly because we're getting older as a society. We've promised certain benefits to people over roughly 65. I'm 67. I think Alan Blinder's is just a couple years older than that.
Just a couple.
A big couple. And so they've promised these benefits to these old generations, and the percentage of the population that's over those eligibility ages is growing. Partly it's because people are having smaller children, so there's not as many people coming into the workforce, and partly because we're living longer. And so we have these healthcare programs that and Social Security programs for the elderly that people like. Even Donald Trump has said he doesn't want to touch Social Security and Medicare. So it seems unlikely that we're going to get a lot of savings through reduced government spending, given that most of the government spending is in this insurance company element of the federal government. Not to mention the world's an unsafe place now. I don't think we're going to save a lot in defense. I'm not an expert in that. But I don't have the sense that drastically reduced defense spending is going to be part of the story either. Now, to get back to sort of these Social Security, Medicare, I would sort of remind you of a commercial that ran some years ago. When Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House, he tried to enact some relatively modest cuts in Medicare. And this was the ad that was run. This is a still from an ad run on TV. And the ad was basically an actor who looked a lot like Paul Ryan pushing grandma off the cliff. That's what this is. And you saw the whole thing of him, the whole thing was pushing up the hill, and all of a sudden grandma goes and she's flailing. If you really tried to address Social Security and Medicare in a big way, to sort of put the government on a balance through that, then there's no question that you'd see this kind of a thing again. And I think this kind of ad, this kind of politics of this, is why Donald Trump has probably sensibly, from a political standpoint, said, I don't want to touch Social Security and Medicare. So and certainly the Democratic Party is not interested in doing that. So there's really no constituency now to address the major spending programs. Okay, that brings me to the last possible way we could deal with this, which is taxes. And to me, this is the most likely way to deal with this long-term fiscal trajectory. This shows you the sort of tax revenue as a percentage of GDP for different countries. And you see there that the United States is roughly at 28%. And it's not the lowest country in the world in terms of tax burden, but it's lower than many other developed countries that we view ourselves as peers. So I don't think there's any question that we could go from 28% of GDP to high enough to put ourselves on a sustainable path without going completely crazy. We need much higher taxes than we have now, and that would have, for sure, some distortionary effects. But it's not an impossible outcome. Now, economically, I think that makes a lot of sense. But politically, it's much more difficult. There's an old chestnut about Washington politics. And it goes that there are two parties, the evil party and the stupid party. And sometimes the evil party and the stupid party get together and do something that's both stupid and evil. And they call it bipartisanship. Well, let me say there's a bipartisan consensus on tax policy, at least most of tax policy. The Democrats only want to raise taxes on the top 1%. Right? Oh, Joe Biden said nobody making less than $400,000 a year will ever see a tax increase. The Republicans don't want to raise taxes on anybody. So they're in 99% agreement. They only disagree about the top 1%. And that is my definition of bipartisanship. It's both stupid and evil. Because basically, what we do is we need probably more tax revenue to pay for the programs that we want and don't want to get rid of. And how are we going to do it? We're going to do it by taxing most people. We can't do it by just taxing the top 1%. If you look at Europe, how does Europe get all those taxes much higher? They don't do it by taxing the rich more than we do. They get it by taxing the middle class more than we do. And they have this thing called the value-added tax. The value-added tax is basically a form of retail sales tax. Sort of like the tax a lot of states collect, retail sales taxes. And the reason it's called the value-added tax is it's collected along the chain of production, and that's done that way rather than at the final retail levels. They think it increases tax compliance if you do it in stages rather than doing it all at once. It's harder to evade. So it's basically a retail sales tax. And of course, a retail sales tax affects many middle-class voters. So that is the missing tax. The tax we do not have that most of the world has is a value-added tax. And that would raise efficiently lots and lots of money. This shows you a map of the countries in blue are the countries, like the United States, are the countries that do not have a value-added tax. You see, that's basically the United States and just a few other random countries. Basically, everybody has a value-added tax, except for us and a few other random countries. So the value-added tax is kind of universal. It's kind of considered best practices around the world by tax authorities, and we don't have it. And my own guess is that's what eventually we're going to have to do to raise the revenue we have to pay for the government we want. Now, as we said, there's no political consensus on this. There's nobody in Washington who's running on a value-added tax. I can say this because I have tenure. But if I had to be elected every 2 years, I'd run away from a value-added tax. It's very unpopular because it basically hits the middle class. And my opponent would say, he wants to tax the middle class. And indeed, I do. Okay, so under what circumstance might we get this? Well, we could get this value-added tax if Congress gets together and says, let's be rational planners. Let's look ahead. Let's make a sensible long-term fiscal plans. I have no hope that'll ever happen. It could happen, though, in the midst of a financial crisis, where the bond market starts saying, we used to think these guys in the United States were really sensible, but they're looking a lot like Argentina lately. So this is an article I wrote, and if you look at the date on this, if you can see the date, this is the New York Times. I wrote this in 2011. And I wrote it, it's titled, It's 2026 and the Debt is Due. And I wrote this as a hypothetical speech from the President of the United States about what he would say in the midst of a financial crisis where the bond market suddenly stopped trusting the United States. And I was worried about the fiscal trajectory as I am now. I didn't think the crisis was imminent, but I thought it was in the future. And I thought we needed to start thinking about it. And so I set it 15 years ahead. 15 years ahead was really just kind of a made-up number. I could have done it 20 years ahead, 10 years ahead. But I didn't think it was imminent, but so I just put it 15 years ahead. If this happens next year, I'm going to really claim a lot of credit for this. But I don't know. I still don't think it's imminent. I don't think it's going to happen necessarily next year. It could happen next year, but I could go on for another 10, 20 years as things get worse and worse. Now, I wrote this article in 2011, and immediately after the article came out, I got this email from Alice Rivlin. Now, people who know, Alice Rivlin was one of the great policy economists of the 20th century. Founding director of the Congressional Budget Office, vice chair of the Fed, just an amazing economist. And she wrote me this email about this article. She said, great piece in the New York Times on the debt, but I doubt it'll give us 15, I doubt the markets will give us 15 years, maybe 5. So I was writing this back in 2011. She said, I don't think we're going to wait till 2026. Something terrible is going to happen in 5 years. So obviously Alice, despite being one of the most brilliant economists I've ever met, got that wrong. And this fact she got this wrong reminds me of this fantastic quote from my teacher at MIT, Rudy Dornbush, who said, in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then happen faster than you think they could. And I think that is the situation we have with the debt. I think the bond market's going to let us go on for a while, but then when they change their mind, it's all going to happen very fast and very dramatically. And it's obviously not the best way to deal with the long-term fiscal imbalance, is to do it under duress. Here's a headline from the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago. U.S. loses last AAA credit rating. And I think of this kind of headline that all of a sudden the bond rating agencies say, these guys aren't really the best, the most safe debt asset out there. It's sort of like seeing cracks in your foundation. And if your building inspector comes and says, I see some cracks in this foundation here, and you should probably worry about that. And you say, well, the building's not falling down, just a few cracks. You don't want to wait until the building's falling down. It's the time the building's falling down, the recovery is much more difficult. And so I see increasingly headlines like this, that we're starting to see cracks in the foundation. But when the building will actually fall down is anybody's guess. Let me conclude with one more cartoon. This is my favorite cartoon about the government debt. Our deficit reduction plan is simple, the economic advisors tell the president, but it will require a great deal of money. And I like that cartoon because I think it also summarizes the choices we face going forward. I don't think it's hard economically to think through how to put us on a sustainable path. I think if you made Alan Blinder and I co-monarchs, I think we could fix it probably in the afternoon. But
Into the evening.
Into the evening, okay. Well, that's how we can have drinks. So I think it's easy solutions, but it does require a great deal of money. And that doesn't make it economically difficult, but it makes it politically very difficult. And let me stop there, and I look forward to chatting with Alan and taking any of your questions. Thank you so much.
I think this is on. You can hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Greg. That was terrific. And as I had, whoops, I'm tied up. As I'd indicated, simple, easy to understand, straightforward. I want to start with kind of a capstone question on this. You very strongly suggested that the way out, if we take it, is going to be higher taxes, perhaps a value-added tax. Doesn't have to be a value-added tax. I'd like to ask you to just indicate the number, like taxes to GDP. We don't have to go to France.
No.
By any means. If you could put that, is someone controlling these slides? No. Who was? Yeah,
I was before, but
the green bars.
we want to see the taxes percent.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. If you could comment on where the U.S. would need to be.
There's people who do work on what's called the fiscal gap. I mean, Auerbach and Kolikoff do some of the best work on that. Mm-hmm. My sense is if you go to, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but if you go from the United States to where, say, New Zealand is, you'd basically be most of the way there. Yeah. You don't need to be France, for sure. Because these other countries not only have the programs we have, they have much more extensive government programs, things like universal health care and so on. So if you want to do that, you're going to finance not only our current programs, but additional programs that Europe offers. Then you do have to go to Germany, France level. But no, this just deal with the fiscal gap we have now. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so it's as you said, politically it's a very big deal, but economically it's not that big a deal, which is why you and I as monarchs could fix it in a day.
Yes.
I want to lead from that to the, you didn't use the phrase, but you talked around it, the bond market vigilantes.
Right.
So Alice, for whom I have boundless admiration, just as you do, was way ahead, was worried about calamity way too long. I want to just put one more fact into the hopper and then phrase a question. When I was in the Clinton administration, this is ancient history, in 1993, what was thought then to be heavy deficit reduction was sold to the new president by his economic team, not mainly by me, but by his economic team, on the grounds that calamity was around the corner. I was always skeptical. I didn't open my mouth when Bob Rubin would say, based on 26 years in the markets, I see calamity around the corner. The debt to GDP ratio was, I'm going to say 35%,
yes,
or something like that. It didn't happen in 1993. It didn't happen in 2011. Here we are in 2025. There are some stirrings of the vigilantes, stirrings only. I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think back then it was wise to reduce the budget deficit, but I don't think the calamity was around the corner. And when calamity occurs, it's not just that we reach a certain magic threshold. It's that when the psychology of markets change, when they look and they say, these guys aren't serious, and they're not going to get serious anytime soon, and that's when they get scared. We see, we see a variety of headlines that sort of are cracks. I just gave the one about the downgrade, but I had another one before that one came out about how investors are getting nervous and how certain treasury auctions are undersubscribed, or people are worried that it wasn't a strong auction. So you see sort of headlines. I view those, again, it's just like cracks in the foundation. They're warning signs. Nothing's about to happen. But if you have cracks in your foundation, you don't know. The engineer can't tell you what day the building's going to collapse. And if you say, I know I have cracks in the foundation, but you told me that last year, and I still had cracks in the foundation. Nothing bad's happened. So why should I worry about the cracks now? I think that's the situation we face. In an ideal world, we'd be forward-looking and sort of plan ahead. The political process now only looks ahead 2 or 4 years, and so they're probably thinking, oh, I probably don't need to worry about this over the next 4 years. And they're probably right. And so they're going to basically kick the can down the road to the next. And this is a bipartisan problem. You're right. The Clinton administration did help back then, but since then, the Biden administration didn't do any more than the Trump administration did. So this is sort of a bipartisan consensus not to worry about this problem.
Yeah.
I remember talking to somebody in the Biden administration, an advisor close advisor to Biden. He said, we have three things that we'd like to do. We don't want to raise taxes for people under 400,000. We want to make all these investments in infrastructure and so on. And we'd like to go on a sustainable path. And we realize we can't do 3 out of 3, so we're only doing the first 2.
Yeah.
They kind of knew that. They knew that.
Yeah.
They weren't surprised.
Yeah. The economists in every administration have known the numbers, and they don't. the numbers, the projections don't change when the party of the president changes. They look basically the same. Let me move off calamity a little bit to something that we feel more comfortable about, which is interest rates. That is, are you surprised, I'll admit I am, with how little interest rate response there has been a little bit lately to ever-rising deficits and projected deficits? And why do you think it is?
It is surprising. I think it's in part because the idea of U.S. government default is so unthinkable that people don't want to think about it. But I think once they think it's, all of a sudden they say, this is not unthinkable. And then they say, I really don't want government bonds. And then that's when things will move very fast. That's the whole Rudy Dornbush thing. But I agree. It's amazing that a 30-year government bond is only paying 5% nominal.
And it doesn't have to be default. It could just be we're shoving this much money into the world's portfolios.
Yes.
And the portfolio holders may not want so many dollar assets.
We have had the advantage, which economists call the exorbitant privilege, as you know, to basically being sort of the world's reserve currency. That's not foreordained. It's just that we don't have any good competitors right now. It's not inconceivable that a competitor could come up. Some people think it's Bitcoin. I'm a skeptic of Bitcoin, but it's not inconceivable. Could the renminbi be it? Maybe.
Trump coin.
Trump coin, yes, Trump coin. So it's not preordained that we will always be the dollar, but I think that has meant people are willing to hold the dollar. I've noticed, for example, that gold has gone up recently this year. To what extent is that people saying, maybe I'd rather hold money in something like gold than treasury assets? That's also sort of a sign that people are a little skeptical of the dollar.
Yeah, it is. I want to ask one more question, then turn it over to the audience. A here and now question. You alluded to briefly the big, beautiful bill. By the way, if you don't know it, that's what they actually titled it in the House. They passed the big, beautiful bill. That's its name. Anyway, that's a sign of the times also. It's heading for the Senate, the big, beautiful bill, where changes are promised by a number of senators. But one thing that seems to be going on in the Senate that was rejected by the House is what we used to call directed scorekeeping. They have a different name for it, which is lying now. But what I really mean is not counting the need to refinance the 2017 tax cuts as an expenditure item on the books. I'd like to hear whether you think they will actually do it, what it would mean for the future, et cetera.
I don't know. I'm very apprehensive about the whole political process in Washington. I have not been following the details of that. I do know that CBO is there and giving very honest numbers. And I would trust CBO. After the current director of CBO is a former student of mine, Phil Swagel, fantastic.
Princeton undergraduate.
Princeton undergraduate, yes, another Princeton undergraduate. And he came to grad school at Harvard. He's a fantastic person. He's a really honest guy. It's in good hands. So I think you can trust numbers coming out of CBO. But they're always operating under constraints directed by the Congress. So if the Congress tells them you have to estimate under the following set of assumptions, then they'll do it. Because they follow orders, but the more they constrain CBO in putting out the numbers, the less reliable the numbers become.
Yeah, that looks like what it may happen. Yes. Anyway, we don't know. We'll know soon.
Yes.
It's headed for the big, beautiful bill is on its way to the...
And part of the big beautiful bill, I should note, is a pretty big tax. I heard different numbers, so floating around, so I don't know the exact number, a pretty big tax on endowments. I mean, there's already a small tax on endowments, but part of it's a pretty big tax on endowments. So places with big endowments like Harvard and Princeton are really going to have to tighten their belts when this bill hits the books. I think I'd be surprised if that Senate changes that in a big way. So I think there's going to be big tax on endowments. So please, when you get your annual giving request, just remember that Princeton is particularly in a difficult situation right now.
Princeton's actually, this is my last comment though, Princeton's actually on the top of that heap. If you look at endowment per student or endowment per anything, we're number one. Harvard has a bigger endowment, but it's a much bigger
that is
place.
true. No, Princeton is number one on the endowment per student basis. So we really hit. I will say though that I think Harvard has more hatred from the Trump administration than Princeton does.
It does.
Right now.
To your everlasting credit. Thank you. Let's open it up to questions from the floor. Do we have microphones?
I've been asked by the university to enforce a short question, no meandering, keep it on topic. So I just wanted to say we will be enforcing that.
Yes, the ideal. I always tell my students the ideal question is short and ends in a question mark.
Thank you for that, Greg. So we're going to enforce the short ends with a question mark.
Short on the part?
Yes.
Your question is behind you, Greg.
Good morning,
Oh, hi.
and thank you both for being here and conducting this forum. I'm curious about what you think about the Trump administration's idea of no taxes on U.S. treasuries. That's been floated.
No taxes on U.S. treasuries?
Trump has mentioned, they mentioned it during his campaign, that was something he was
I had not heard that. I had not heard that.
I don't think that's in the big, beautiful bill.
He
Social
felt
Security.
that that was the way to keep interest rates low.
Well, it would. I mean, it would basically turn treasuries into municipals.
Yes, that's exactly it.
That would reduce. I mean, on the other hand, it also reduced revenues. So I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a net positive for the government. It would reduce the interest payments, but also reduce revenues. So I'm not.
But it would also counteract what's going on with the downgrade and the possible ballooning of the debt and everything else. It turns U.S. Treasuries into a better security for people.
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly lower interest payments, but it would. I've not heard this proposal, but I'm not sure it put us on a better fiscal trajectory because you're reducing tax revenue at the same time you're reducing interest payments.
All right.
I have a question for you. I'm curious what grade you would give the big, beautiful bill in terms of how much growth it will generate. And, if that's not, even with great inflation, a high grade, what would you do to change it? They put a lot in terms of personal taxes. And some of the things in the first version were more pro-growth. And so I'm curious on your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, the first Trump tax bill in 2017 did one very important thing, which is it reduced the corporate tax rate from 35 to something 21, I guess, something much closer to the historical, the international average. So if you look at sort of the statutory tax on corporations in most of Europe, it was much lower than we faced in 2017. So I think that change was the most important thing. There's a lot of other stuff that I didn't like in that bill, but I think that was, one of the biggest things in that bill, and that was, I think, a step in the right direction. That's already been done. And so this new bill is not doing that. And in fact, I think that was made permanent in the original bill. That was not unlike the other stuff, that was not phased out. So the stuff that we're doing now strikes me as much less pro-growth oriented. A lot of the stuff that's going on, like no tax on tips, is really just sort of political pandering. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense from the standpoint of optimal tax policy. I don't think I've ever heard an economist propose no tax on tips. There's a whole literature on optimal tax policy, and there's lots of proposals out there that you could choose from. No tax on tips was not one of them. I don't think any economist has ever said this was a good idea. So that was obvious. And to be honest, most of the people working for tip income aren't paying a lot of federal income tax anyway. So it's not really helping people that much. So So I'm not a huge fan of this bill. As I said, I would really love to. I'd like to see someone take the long-term fiscal trajectory seriously. Paul Ryan had a proposal back when they were doing the 2017 bill. He was trying to reform the corporate rate, called corporate tax, to something called a business activities tax. His business activities tax was very similar to a value-added tax. He didn't call it that because it sounds too damn European, but his business activities tax was very much like a value-added tax. So I think he understood the details of tax policy pretty well. He didn't really want to be Speaker of the House. He wanted to be Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He really loved tax policy, and he'd been studying this for years. The poor guy had to become Speaker of the House, and it didn't end well for him. But I think there are people out there who kind of understand that would be one way to do it. But another good way to raise revenue, I didn't mention this, but if I were sort of, again, if Al and I were co-monarchs, I think we could agree on this. Another sort of tax I'd like to use to raise revenue is a tax on carbon. Because actually, unlike President Trump, who apparently doesn't believe in climate change. I'm not saying that as a joke. I've talked to people who worked in the first administration. He does not believe in climate change. So he's not interested in anything in climate change. But most people do. I think most scientists do. And I think most economists say that the simplest approach to dealing with climate change would be a tax on carbon emissions. And so we don't think we can close the fiscal gap just with that, but I think we could raise a fair amount of revenue that way. And so that's another sort of tax that I would put on the table. But no, a lot of the stuff that's in this bill, I think is, I don't really like any really part of the bill a lot. I'm sure if I went to details, I'm sure I could find some detail I like. But by and large, I'm not a big fan.
It's big and beautiful. You must be able to find something.
It is very big.
Sir, among the vectors that you had discussed, the 5 vectors for deficit reduction or for fiscal adjustment, default being key among them, and there are many different ways to default, as you sort of discussed. I'm wondering about financial repression and what sort of toolkit might be considered for that. There's Treasury Concord, et cetera, but in the past, but what else is possible?
Yeah, no, I mean, when countries run into these problems, they basically, there's a variety of tools that go to the broad category of financial repression, which is basically saying we're going to force certain people to buy our debt and or hold our debts at very low interest rates. So, imagine you go into the banks and you said, if you want to be a chartered bank, you have to hold some amount of U.S. government debt at a low interest rate, or something like that. Steve Myron, who's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, has written stuff, what's sometimes referred to as the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which he basically wants to go to foreigners who are holding lots of U.S. government debt and swap it for low interest, like 100-year zero coupon bonds, which is almost like a form of, and to threaten them with like tariffs if they don't willing to make the swap. So lots of our debt is held abroad. So if we defaulted, part of the people we'd be defaulting on would be the Chinese and so on, who are holding lots of government debts, and that might actually make it more attractive to default for some policymakers. So you're right. So I think there's a variety of tools short of default that are default-like. And I said that I don't think when FDR decided to cross off the gold clauses, it was obviously a form of default because there's a part of the contract you're not honoring. He didn't call it that. He didn't say, "Oh, by the way, I'm defaulting." He said, "No, it's just this gold clause. It's just this one clause. I'm just not going to honor that." I mean, of course, we'll repay the debts, but you're not repaying debts on the terms that you agreed to. So I'm sure there'll be intermediate steps and sort of tools that people find that sort of an economist say that's kind of partial default, even though the people who are doing it won't call it that.
I think I was taught here at Princeton, the reason we don't have a value-added tax is the way we could get one is if we can convince Republicans that it was regressive and the Democrats that it's a money machine. Yes. Then we'd have it, because right now the Democrats think it's regressive and the Republicans think it's a money machine.
Yeah, that's actually Larry Summers' line. Larry Summers always said we don't have a value-added tax because Democrats think it's regressive, and the Republicans think it's a money machine to finance ever larger government. And if they get them to switch positions, then we'll get a value-added tax because they'll both love it. So you're right. I mean, there's parts of people to love and hate in a value-added tax wherever your politics is. I like a value-added tax because it's a broad tax. It's a tax on consumption. And I think we have a large economic literature that says taxes on consumption are more efficient than taxes on income. And we know it works. I mean, a lot of countries do use it and raise a lot of revenue with it.
And that was my question, is we seem to be going to a 10% tariff. That seems to be a back-end tax on consumption.
But
is there a way?
But it's a tax only on imported consumption. It's a tax on some.
Well, it's a step towards a tax.
Yeah, it's a small.
Is there a way to use that partially?
You raise a very interesting question. Donald Trump, when he talks about all the trade restrictions that other countries are imposing on us, he points to their value-added taxes as a form of trade restriction. And he says it's a trade restriction because they exempt exports. Now, that doesn't make any sense. But within the country, whether it's an import or a domestically produced good, it's the same tax. So it's not really discriminating against imports. It's not a trade restriction, but he's somehow got in his head that a value-added tax is a trade restriction. And I had this sort of momentary fantasy that Kevin Hassett, his economic advisor, could say, you're right, they're really screwing us with their value-added taxes. We should get a value-added tax too. Yeah. And then we can screw them. And maybe Trump would buy that, even though it's completely ridiculous, the argument. But I think the policy makes sense. But this idea of looking at a value-added tax in another country as a trade restriction is just wrong economically. It's just there's so much confusion coming from the Trump team about international economics. I'm not an international economist, but I do teach a little bit about introductory micro and macro. And there's so many basic things he gets wrong. Things like a value-added tax not being a trade restriction. Things like bilateral trade balances mattering. The fact that trade deficits having to do with trade restrictions rather than savings and investment imbalances. There's so many things that he says that really are inconsistent with Econ 101 and 102. I guess that's what they call it still at Princeton, 101? It's Ec 10 at Harvard.
Not 102. 102 jumped ahead to be 100.
100. Oh, 100. Okay, so it's 100 and 101 now. That's right. Okay. So much of the arguments he makes, sadly, even some of his economic advisors, like Kevin Hassett, I've known for a long time, is head director of the National Economic Council. I like Kevin. He's a smart guy. But I've heard him going on TV saying, well, obviously imports reduce GDP because they subtract off at the end, right? Minus M, right? But no, we subtract it off at the end because it's added in C, I, and G. So even I've inherited Kevin, who knows better, making nonsensical arguments on TV to justify what are basically nonsensical policies.
This is at Princeton. This is like lecture 2 in Economics 101. Yeah. What you just said.
Yes.
Peter Coffin, 79 history major. The graph you showed of percent GDP with the spikes for the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War I, that implies that the percent of GDP is imposed by crises. The most recent depression didn't get a chance to come down. Is that because of inflation? And then you have a spike for the label says it's COVID, but I'm wondering the underlying growth of government. Is there something that the spikes, yes, they're explained, but there's other reasons for growth of government?
There has been a trend to growth in government, mainly because we've increased the social safety net with things like Social Security and Medicare, and more people become eligible as we become older as a society. That's more of a trend thing. The sudden changes, the big spikes, they tend to happen with crises when the government says, "I'm going to do extraordinary things. We're going to fight the Nazis." That's an extraordinary thing. We're going to throw money at people because we asked them to stay at home because of the pandemic. That's an extraordinary thing. So all these spikes are basically really extraordinary events, and you can very pinpoint what exactly is happening. Part of it's also in recessions, revenue comes down. So like the Great Depression, revenue is also falling, so the deficit automatically goes up. But you're right, there's trend growth in government, which is really due to the expansion of the social safety net. But the big movements in this particular variable tend to come from these military and domestic crises.
I had the impression, I'm over here.
Oh, thank you.
I had the impression that default on one sovereign debt was kind of a nuclear option, and that the penalty for Russia or Argentina or others, from defaulting on the debt is that they become a pariah in financial markets. So I was surprised by the idea that the U.S. had defaulted on the debt in the 30s, I guess my question is this: what do you see as the practical implications for the United States if we do, in fact, default on our debt in a way that's seen as a default on our debt?
Oh, I think it'd be catastrophic. I mean, I think it's not an easy thing to do. Interestingly, though, countries do come back. I mean, Argentina does come back. Argentina defaults on its debt, and a few years later, they're borrowing again. It's kind of amazing. That doesn't sound catastrophic. They have a tough few years. I don't think the immediate aftermath is painful when this happens. But this idea that it's a pariah permanently, that's I don't think that's not the case. But I don't want to rule out. Well, there's a couple things to say about default. It's not an easy solution. Secondly, it's not going to completely solve the problems. Even if we default on the existing debt, we still have the structural deficits, and we still have to pay for programs going forward. We've forgiven our past debts. We're still sort of not living within our means on a cash flow basis. So we still have to have some sort of fiscal adjustment on either spending or taxes going forward, but obviously much smaller than if we didn't have to service the debt. I mean, there's a fact that a lot of people, the news finds shocking, like we pay more in interest on the debt now than we do for national defense. I think that's true, but I'm not sure it's a particularly a natural threshold. It doesn't, that comparison didn't sort of pop out of any of my economic models, but maybe it's just sort of a striking to people to realize how much we're spending on interest on the debt. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Also, because just a couple of years ago, it was very low because interest rates were
for a while, a lot of this, people didn't worry about it because people were interest rates are basically zero between 2008 and basically in 2019. So we spent a long period of time of basically zero interest rates. And there were economists writing, including my colleague Larry Summers and Jason Furman, about, we don't need to worry about the debt. Interest is so low. Government spending is kind of free. We should invest in more infrastructure and all finance it all. But I think counting on interest rates staying at that level forever was, I think, too optimistic. And now interest rates are back to kind of normal levels. Do you think now is kind of normal? Sort of the 5%? Seems pretty normal. So I don't think we're going back to, unless we have some sort of economic catastrophe, I don't think we're going back to zero anytime soon. So servicing the debt is a real cost, for exactly what Alan said. These interest rates are not zero.
And about 40% of the debt is owned abroad. About 60% is owned by American entities of some kind.
Yes.
Thank you for great talks. I remember that the deficit went up under Reagan due to national defense spending, and then
you can see that here. You can see that in the picture here. So if you look in the 80s, you can see that's one of the periods of rising debt without some crisis.
Right. And that Bill Clinton brought it down. How did he bring it down? I just don't know. It's an honest question.
Well, a couple of things. He did raise taxes, and there was a productivity acceleration, which brought in more revenue, and he didn't spend the extra revenue. I mean, I remember the phrase he used at the time was, when he started running budget surpluses because all this extra revenue was coming in, he said, let's save Social Security first. And for some reason, that really stopped people from actually spending the revenue. He never actually changed Social Security at all. But this phrase, save Social Security first, there was a rallying cry for let's not spend this money until we've saved Social Security. So they ended up running budget surpluses for a little while, and you can see there again the debt coming down. You can see though that even the Reagan era and the Clinton era, sort of that blip around the early 90s, up and down, that's small compared to what's happened recently, right? I remember my colleague Ben Friedman wrote a book called Day of Reckoning about the Reagan stuff. Well, look at now we have an increase that's what I don't know. It looks like it's 2 to 3 times the size. Well, this is a ratio to GDP. So
ratio.
I'm trying to normalize this to the size of the economy. So that's why sometimes you'll see numbers, those raw numbers of debt. Like we've increased the debt more since the past 8 years than we have in the previous 200. Those kind of numbers aren't comparable because they're not looking at the size of the economy and stuff. This is why I think this is kind of a sort of fair way to look at it. Sometimes people look at his debt service as a percentage of GDP, which basically brings in interest rates. And then you will see debt service didn't look so bad, and then debt service is coming up because of high interest rates.
Where are you?
Trevor Ford, 74. My question is, the Japanese sort of defaulted or did not buy the bonds the way we expected a few weeks ago, how much should we be concerned that a lot of foreigners hold our debt, and if they refuse to buy the bonds at the rates that they've been doing, how much is my money going to be defaulted in the next year or so?
Well, the United States bonds are sort of the world currency. So you see a lot of them held abroad in sovereign wealth funds and central banks. And so if you think of what the bond vigilantes would do, people start worrying. The people who are worrying wouldn't necessarily be bondholders. It could also be foreign central banks. If foreign central banks decide at some point, gee, we have a lot of government debt on our balance sheet, let's increase gold, or let's increase euro bonds, or something like that. That could be part of the reason why the bond market all of a sudden stops absorbing our debt. And what that's going to mean is that interest rates would rise, and that's going to put pressure on the Congress to deal with these issues. And then they'll have to deal with these issues one of the 5 ways I suggested. I mean, as I said, I can't think of any other ways other than those 5 to deal with that. That's why I want to be comprehensive. This is the possible things how these things could get resolved. But you're right. Much of our debt is held abroad, as Alan pointed out a moment ago, and the perceptions of foreigners to the United States traditionally we're viewed as a very stable country, where it's like a safe haven. In the middle of a crisis, where do people go? People flee to the United States because that's like a safe place to keep your money. To the extent we look like a less stable democracy, which I think we are looking less stable than we have in the past, our role as a safe haven in crises could change, and that would be worrying.
If I could add 2 things to that very briefly. Sure. The Chinese have already reduced the share of their reserves that they hold in U.S. dollars. They still hold a lot, but as a share they have reduced it. And the second is to your point about the rule of law. I don't know whether you agree, but things that for my entire professional life I've thought are unthinkable are now not unthinkable any longer, such as I could imagine the current president telling foreign holders of U.S. debt, you're only getting 80% on your money?
Yes.
This is now a thinkable event, which it never was before. And if that moves from thinkable to, I don't know, a little bit likely, you can have a total rout.
Right. Yes, and the question becomes sort of, can they monitor? I don't know. Can they monitor that? I mean, if
they know who owns it.
But can the Chinese quickly sell? If that starts becoming thinkable, because the Chinese then say, "Oh, we're going to sell our debt to some American who's going to get paid dollar for dollar."
Yeah. So I mean, as you know, it depends on how thick or how thin that kind of event makes the market. It's very thick now.
Yes.
They can sell huge amounts in short periods of time. It'll get thinner if things start going crazy.
Yes, I mean, this goes a little back to Madison and Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
Madison only wanted to pay off the people that actually lent money to the government, as opposed to the speculators who had bought it. Can you distinguish between different holders of the bonds and treat them differently? And one thing Trump has done is he's opened what I think is called the Overton window. The things that were once unthinkable are now thinkable. In fact, they're happening now, and it's really quite extraordinary. How big did that window get? I don't know.
Bryce Dakin, class of 1995. There's a slide that shows the relative tax burden with 28% for the U.S. My assumption is that's just federal taxes?
I think that was total.
I think that was all. I think it's all taxes.
Yeah,
so state too?
Yes, I believe it includes. Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. That was it.
The total government revenue, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So, Greg, you had mentioned those 5 categories and the 5 ways that this could potentially play out. And then you also had mentioned that numerically it should add up to at least 100%. Would you like to hazard an estimate on that as to getting to 100%, or at least just give it an ordinal probabilistic ranking for what you think might be most or least probable?
I think the most likely outcome is the raise taxes one, which is why I ended with that. I think the way to do it would be deliberately and slowly, and so the one is disruptive. I mean, in the article I wrote in the New York Times, which is the president was giving a speech. It was after the bond vigilantes had basically panicked, and they couldn't. And in my hypothetical future, they couldn't borrow anymore, and so the United States was turning to the IMF for a bailout. The IMF, in my hypothetical future, had been relocated to Beijing. So they returned to Beijing for a bailout to help the United States survive our crisis in the same way that Argentina would turn to the United States and Washington and the IMF now. And in the hypothetical future, there were both higher taxes, but also substantial, what now viewed as unthinkable cuts in spending. Things like, we're going to cut Social Security, or we're going to raise the age of eligibility for Medicare. I mean, I once saw a poll that where a large fraction of economists thought the idea of raising the age of eligibility for Social Security was a good idea, because as people are living longer, it's the idea that you'd become eligible at a later age. That polls terribly in the general public. The general public hates the idea of raising the age of eligibility for Social Security, from which I infer that economists like their jobs better than most people. So, because we don't mind working a few extra years, but most people hate the idea. So I think there's, in a crisis, you can imagine the president proposing things he would never propose in a non-crisis. So I can imagine there being substantial spending cuts. One of the things that there's literature that I've struggled with a little bit is my late colleague, Alberto Alesina, and sometimes several co-authors, has written about fiscal adjustments and the sustainability of fiscal adjustments. And what he tends to find is that fiscal adjustments that happen on the spending side tend to be more sustainable than fiscal adjustments that happen on the tax side. I can't quite tell how important that result is, or how to think about that, or how robust it is. Because if that's the case, then you'd want to think more about spending. I think of our spending as kind of low compared to most European countries that he was studying. So we already kind of have low spending. So that's why I'm guessing that our adjustment's going to have to be more on the tax side. Also because I know that there's a tax out there that we don't have, that's pretty efficient, that we know works. But as I said, there's literally no, I don't know of any elected politician who has said, I'm in favor of a value-added tax.
Or any tax.
Or any tax. Any tax. But especially a tax in the middle class.
Yeah. Let me just add one little thought there. I think that these last two on the slide are very, very difficult until you disabuse somehow. This is a plug for education. The American voting public of the idea that we're a very high tax, big government society. And if anyone's paying attention to Economics 100 or 101 knows that's not close to true, right. But it's widely believed.
Right.
Hi, Pratyusha from class of 2015. Wanted to end on a slightly more optimistic note. What do you think is the best case scenario on option one, growing very fast?
Well, I know people talk. I mean, some of the technology optimists talk about the singularity, where all of a sudden AI is going to start inventing things in ways that we can't imagine, and all of a sudden we're going to be. What we know for sure as economists is that technological progress is basically the source of growth. And so the question is, what's the future path of technology going to be? Now, there's a whole literature, I can give you some citations on this, about how growth has slowed down because we're running out of ideas. And so people are kind of pessimistic. There's some economists out there who have been pessimistic about future growth because they think of all the big ideas have already been had. Whereas there's the other side, technology optimists saying, no, maybe we humans have run out of ideas, but wait until we have artificial intelligence. These guys are going to create ideas that we can't even imagine. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And so I think it's conceivable, but it strikes me as slightly too science fiction-y for me. So I'm deeply skeptical about it, but I hope I'm wrong, because faster growth solves lots and lots of problems.
Without in any way disagreeing with us, I just want to add a numerical fact. If you look at periods of, and you need to look at long periods, productivity growth rates in the US, or you could take other advanced countries, a change from one era to another of 1.5 points is like gigantic, monumental. They hardly ever happen. And that's not even close to going from 2 to 6.
Yeah, exactly. So these technological optimists talk about 6. It's never, I mean, there are countries that have grown at 6%, but there are always countries well below the technological frontier and are catching up. There's never been a country at the technological frontier who has grown 6% for a prolonged period of time. It's never happened. So, so the people who are saying this are basically saying we're about to enter an era completely unlike anything in human history. That's possible, but it seems kind of unlikely to me.
Well, let's hope that it's true.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much.